Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome an accomplished, senior, and respected professional from Syracuse, New York, USA, Mr. Mark Britz. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Mark is the Senior Director of Learning and Development at PGP Learning. He's an author, and all of you know I'm very partial to authors. He's an author of a book titled Social by Design, How to Create and Scale a Collaborative Company. He's been recognized by the Internet Time Alliance with the J. Cross Memorial Award. He's also been recognized in 2022 by the CNY Business Journal for Nonprofit Board Leadership and Development. So, Mark, before we get into learning and development, tell me about your own journey in brief and what inspired you to transition from a career in education to learning design.
Yeah, that's a great question. I love teaching. I was a middle school and high school teacher here in both New York State and in Arizona, and I really thought it was going to be my career path all my life, and I enjoyed it greatly. But honestly, inspiration is an interesting word, and what inspired me to move on from that. It's more about I wanted to own a home. And, education doesn't pay a lot. So, I was at a point in my career where I had an opportunity during the dot-com era to join a company who designed learning simulations, and they wanted teacher types, people who understood learning objectives. I took the opportunity, I took the chance. It was early in my career, and I never looked back.
Amazing. Amazing. And as they say, the rest is history.
The rest is history, for sure.
So let's talk learning and development, Mark.
Sure.
My first question to you is, what are some of the common mistakes organizations make when designing their L&D programs?
Yeah, well, you pinpoint organizations and the mistakes they make. And I think sometimes there's two things I look at, right? One is I think organizations have unfortunately viewed learning as classroom. They viewed learning as something to be completed as opposed to a journey. And because of that leadership, that mentality high above L&D has kind of pigeonholed L&D into this frame of thinking. And really their jobs depend on it. In many cases, L&D can't get outside of that. This is the expectation. And to challenge that notion, L&D has to get outside of that box. And the best way to do that, of course, is to ask the right questions of their leadership in terms of what are the outcomes they want to see, not what their expectations are in terms of a deliverable. So I think the biggest challenge I think that organizations present is just that learning is seen as some type of a delivery of content over that experience or that journey, and a journey that typically happens internally inside somebody's makeup as they grow. So I think that's the key problem that organizations face and need to be challenged on.
Well said. And what role does technology play in the transformation of the L&D space?
Yeah, well, technology is so broad, right? So it's a vast amount of things. And if you look at it, what we've seen over the years has been L&D technology has been very specific to, authoring courses and content in different mediums and delivering that out. But I think the biggest thing happening right now is regarding technology such as AI. And I don't want to go down a huge path of AI, but I think what we're starting to see is L&D has a choice to make, and that is they could invest in L&D to improve their own performance, which ultimately, sadly, I think comes down to making courses and content faster versus really understanding how AI is being used in the organization, from automation to generative AI, to understand that work is changing, because their fundamental role of L&D is to support how work is done and improve how work is done. And if we don't understand that AI, for example, is transforming how work is done, then L&D is going to be back over here producing a lot of resources and content that is moot over time. So I think the transformation that we're seeing is one that either L&D has to embrace or L&D is going to be left behind.
Well said. And, when you look at L&D, it was always in organizations that were in buildings together, etc. But now the entire work paradigm has changed.
Yeah.
I often said, and I'm of from the boomers generation. I remember it used to be management by walking around and sitting and chatting at the coffee shop, at the cooler or at the coffee machine.
Right.
I want to get your perspective on how has L&D started to evolve in the context of hybrid or remote work environments?
Yeah, I'm probably going to be an outlier on this one because I'm not really confident they have. I mean,
Okay.
a lot of the way the L&D has distributed its learning moved to e-learning, and that can happen remotely,
Mm,
right? So the workforce is now distributed, but the shift has been just meet them where they are,
mm,
versus they're all inside the office somewhere or multiple offices receiving the same content in a similar way.
right.
I think what L&D needs to do, though, just to kind of explore this a little bit with you, is understand that the bigger need right now in a lot of organizations is around engagement and retention of those
Right.
employees and
Mm,
keeping them closely tied to not only just each other, but also the purpose of the organization. And L&D really could play a role in that space, especially when it comes to social connection,
mm,
and engaging with those type of technologies
mm,
that bring people together in more of a community over a corporate type of environment.
mm. Well said. And given the fact that L&D has traditionally been a high touch learning experience, how do you balance, or how do you approach the challenge of balancing scalable learning solutions with
Mhm.
personalized high touch learning experiences?
Yeah, Charles Jennings said something, and I repeat it often. So if you ever follow me on LinkedIn, I would
Mm-hmm.
swear every 6 months I repeat something he said just to
Mm-hmm.
remind people that learning is really four parts. It's experience, it's practice, it's conversation, and it's reflection, right? So I think L&D has typically done really well with the first two,
Mm-hmm.
experience and practice, right? We can build simulations, we can deliver content in certain ways, we can put people in situations to kind of execute in a less authentic environment. But where the rubber hits the road is in the last two, and we haven't done it well. And
Mm-hmm.
that is in those conversations and time for reflection on what people have learned. And I
Right.
think what L&D to basically a scalable learning solution in a sense to have that high touch is to bring people together post content delivery to
Mm-hmm.
have those conversations. And management and the organization needs to create that space for
Mm-hmm.
reflection, right? And reflection comes in many forms. It can be between peers or it can be individual in nature, but to
Mm-hmm.
really process that information. And that's what really makes learning something that is sticky, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
right? So now not only do we get the content pieces that are like you said, scalable, but now we also have the additional piece in here where people are processing that information together
Mm-hmm.
and in context, and then feeding back to L&D what's working, what's not working. And that's that social component that I think is most needed today.
Great response. And Mark, how do you help organizations foster a culture of learning that extends beyond formal training programs?
Yeah, for me, it's always been about middle management and the
Mm,
role of middle management. And what it is often, and I experienced this myself. I would focus on the learner themselves or the
mm,
higher level goals that were supposed to be achieved by the learning solution.
mm,
And that one piece in the middle was their manager, because managers have the ability to influence both up and down, the chain. So, for example, working as a kind of a ghostwriter with a lot of these managers is where I found the most success with any type of learning initiative, be it a
mm,
social focused learning initiative or it be a content focused instructional
mhm,
effort. When middle management is completely bought in, they share the successes, right,
mm,
of those solutions up the chain. So
mhm,
if you're having something that's a little bit more progressive of an idea, then sharing with them so that they understand how to move that to other parts of the organization by going up top. But also what you have to remember too is that those learners typically at the employee level, we'll just look at that level, first of all,
mm,
they're looking to their middle managers for direction,
mm.
for affirmation, if you will. So
Right.
again, if they're bought in, right? So if that middle manager is bought in, that any solution you're putting forward is going to get the attention of the employees underneath because they themselves are bought
Mm,
in. This
mm,
is how I find things spread much faster and have much more success.
Amazing. Could you, for my viewers and listeners and for me, give some examples of how your L&D initiatives have positively impacted employee retention or engagement?
Yeah, it's been a long career. One of the ones that comes to mind, though, is I worked at a healthcare organization in the past. And in that organization, we had a management training that was 10 weeks long. It was about 7 weeks of course content delivered at headquarters. And then this workforce was distributed out, in contextual environments to apply what they're learning in those environments. What we found was that this 10-week period of time was quite draining on these individuals, and we started losing people, 4 or 6 weeks involved. And what the concern, of course, was retention of that employee.
Right.
And so the solution I put in place was literally using blogs. And what we had at the time was SharePoint. And if you've ever used SharePoint before, especially the social features, can be kind of clunky. So we're going back a ways here.
Yeah.
But what happened was when we used the blogs, we were able to connect those employees who went through training together while they were distributed in different offices. And therefore, they could support each other. They were answering each other's questions. They were sharing their work, their frustrations, their successes. And we saw a 13% increase in retention of those employees. They remained engaged in the learning process over those 10 weeks period of time. So that social connection was a critical piece that had been missing once they were distributed. But a simple technology like a blog and some basic rules around how to use it and when to use it made all the difference.
Amazing. Amazing. So one more question relating to L&D, and then we'll move on to another section.
Yeah.
Given, everyone's talking about the future of work, and I want to ask you, how do you see the future of leadership development in organizations?
Yeah, I think we've seen the past few decades have been really focused on leadership, personal characteristics, if you will. I don't know if you look around, if you did a search on Amazon, you're going to see everything is about leadership as being empathy and listening skills, and it's going to be all about the human touch between them. And I think that's important. It's always good to be a good quality person. But I think what we're going to see for the future of work is leaders once again returning to look closely at the machinery of work, right? How does work get done here? And when work is starting to struggle in an organization, what are the levers to be able to pull in the systems, right? The rules and the processes. And I know we'll get into this a little bit, but I think the future of work about leadership in the future of work is about them minding that more consciously, how work is done, not necessarily their own influence personally in the organization, but more about how do I help workers get what they need to get done as seamlessly, efficiently, and effectively as possible. And that has less to do with them than understanding how the organization as a whole is functioning.
Well said. Let's now talk about continuous learning, collaboration, and organizational social design. And my first question is, what does social by design mean in the context of a modern organization? And your book is also titled Social by Design.
Yeah, social by design, it really kind of alludes to the fact about organizational design, right? Something that most people don't even think about. But every organization, I don't care if it's an organization of 3 people or 3,000 people or 30,000 people, they all have a design, right? It's unconscious usually. But within that organizational design are systems of rules and processes and protocols that really guide how people work, but also how people engage with each other when it's acceptable or not acceptable.
Right.
And so social by design is saying, if we look closer at how our organizational design is functioning or not functioning, we can tweak it, modify, not blow it all up and become a teal organization or flat management, but more about making little adjustments that keep people connected and sharing their knowledge openly in the organization. This relates to continuous learning, because continuous learning is not about receiving content. It's again back to that whole thing of like the internal processing, and that is how we connect information in the context as well as between people.
Well said. And how do you approach helping organizations stay small to grow successfully in terms of social design?
Yeah. What I mean by that phrase, and I use it a lot, is staying small to grow successfully. If you've ever been in a small organization, this is where people are learning, they're not worried about their job roles. They're not worried about the parking space in the parking lot, let's
Yeah.
say. They're not as concerned about the hierarchy.
Mm.
Each are helping each other. They're looking over each other's shoulders and they're having conversations openly in the organization. It's easy to do because the
Mm.
organization is small. Typically in those situations, either today, if you're dispersed, you're still 2-3 connections away from the highest levels of the organization.
Mm.
So to say, how do we stay small, right, to grow successfully, is to look at the organization and say, what, again, are those systems, those processes, and those rules that are helping or hindering people from remaining connected in the organization, right? How do we reduce the 10 divisions between people down to 2 divisions of people, right? And a lot of that has to do with, could be psychological safety, but it also has a lot to do with, how do we develop our talent in the organization? That's that organizational design principle, right?
Right.
Business processes, recognition and rewards. If we look carefully at how those things actually function, are they open? Are they transparent? Are they inspiring openness and transparency? So we need to modify those in order to keep people well connected.
And what challenges, in your view, do organizations face when trying to scale collaboration across geographically dispersed teams?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge is our addiction to technology. That we see technology first and foremost as the starting point and the solution in the organization. Versus, again, even with the L&D challenge we talked about earlier about, understanding how work is actually done in the organization, how people actually communicate, what prevents them from doing so. Technology aside, you have to ask the question, if we didn't have these technologies, how would work function here? How would people communicate in the organization? And starting from a point of just what is it that either prevents people from sharing knowledge and what actually helps them from doing so.
Well said. Can you also talk a little bit about the role of social design in preventing silos and improving cross-functional collaboration?
It's interesting. Silos aren't necessarily a bad thing. I think they've been given this perspective of being bad, but I think this, right, from your own experiences. Like silos are kind of where like team unity can form, where expertise can really, really grow. The issue becomes is if we don't make silos a little bit more porous, not necessarily destroy silos, but make them more porous. And technology can play a huge role in that, especially when we look inside organizations who are using tools like Viva Engage, right? Or they're using Teams, or they're using Slack in the organization. The tech itself isn't what's critical, right? But what it does is it does enable people to at least have that entryway point. And now it's about the humans within the system that can modify the rules, the processes, the protocols, as I've mentioned, that either hold people back from being open and honest in those using those tools and sharing their knowledge liberally between them. We don't want to have situations where people are knowledge hoarders because the recognition and reward system prevents them from doing so. We need to attack that recognition and reward system so that the tools themselves just become part of the ecosystem, not the main aspect of breaking down, or in this case, making silos more porous.
Well said. So, Mark, I have time for 2 more questions.
Let's do it.
What role does psychological safety play in fostering an environment of collaboration and continuous learning?
Yeah, I think it's the most critical piece. But I also just think that psychological safety has been reduced to looking at how an individual, like a leader, a manager, behaves and the engagement they have at the team level. And I think that becomes then a problem in an organization because one team and one manager might do it slightly different than another and another and another. So go back to the whole silo question, right? So if we can create more porosity between silos, managers themselves are sharing best practices in creating those environments. But psychological safety is more than just individual behaviors. It's again about the systems we operate in and how, like, for example, if we have a system like recognition and awards that rewards people for individual accomplishment versus collaborative accomplishments, then we start to see people feeling a little less safe about what they share about their peers and their inputs that they have in the organization or on their own projects. We tweak that system, we create much more opportunity for sharing, and then therefore we have a much more safe environment because people are less inhibited.
Great response. And my last question for you, can you tell us a story where you have seen the power of collaboration transform an organization's performance?
Yeah. Actually, I wrote about this recently. I don't know if you're familiar with the bookstore called Barnes and Noble in the United States.
Yeah.
So as we know, over the last few decades, they've struggled against Amazon.
Yeah.
And they brought in a new CEO, James Daunt. And James was a book lover. So his primary thing was just books and wanted to create environments where people who loved books would want to come. Risky proposition because Barnes and Noble at the time was getting much more into, tchotchke sales in their organization. They got away from the books and they had coffee shops and they're selling toys and other things. What he did, I thought was amazing, was he literally turned to the local managers in the organizations and said, you need to pick what the people here in this community, as far as books are concerned, are interested in. And it changed the model because he didn't tell the managers to behave a certain way. He changed the system they operated in. When he gave that particular directive, the managers themselves had to move from a transactional relationship with their work, with their community, to a more transformational one, which became about conversation and community. So managers weren't necessarily just selling a book. They were having conversations with the community when they entered to understand what their book wants and needs were. So Barnes and Nobles became much more about a local Barnes and Noble was different in, say, Iowa than it was in Texas. And this approach, as simple as it sounds, in my mind, is very social by design, right? He opened things up, more transparency between the community itself and how management function. It was fabulous.
How amazing. And on that note, Mark, and your amazing story of Barnes and Noble, I mean, what an amazing brand. I used to go there a lot whenever I was
Same.
But thank you for speaking to me about your own journey. I think we covered a lot of ground in learning and development. I learned some new thoughts from you, got some new ideas from you. Thank you also for speaking to me about social by design, learning and organizational development. So
my pleasure.
Thank you again for speaking to me and good luck.
Good luck. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.